Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. I do ask, first of all, the speakers who are not speaking to please mute your phone, mute your microphones, so we can have a clearer sound. Thank you to all who have joined us, who are joining us today for what I think is going to be a very interesting debate and a very interesting discussion on issues which have been preoccupying us for a while now, but which are even more actual today, given the coronavirus crisis, and given the trade-off that we are doing every day, that the governments have to do every day, between security and protection on one hand, and between freedom and privacy on the other hand. These are issues which we are going to discuss today, to debate today, to investigate a little bit with 5 speakers who come to this debate with different perspectives, from government, from European institutions, from business, as well as from the expert community. Before we go into the discussion, and because we do have 5 speakers and we do want to leave time for questions as well, I do want to go through a little bit of background rules here. We'll be taking your questions, provided that you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask the question. After the speakers would have done their initial presentations, I will go through your questions and comments and read them to the speakers. If you want to address a question to a specific speaker, please state it in your question, or if it's addressed to all of the speakers, again, please say so. My name is Alina Inae. I'm very, very happy to be the moderator of today's discussion. As I said, it's going to be extremely interesting, and I think it's going to be very lively as well. I would go into the first. I would go to give the floor to the first speaker, Cristian Bușoi, who is the chair of the ITRE committee with the European Parliament. And I do have one request to all of the speakers. Please keep your initial remarks to no longer than 10 minutes. So as I said, we can then have times for questions and answers from the audience. Mr. Bușoi, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations for the initiative. I will be brief, and I apologize myself that at some moment I'll have to leave because I'll have to go live on Romanian television. I believe that the topic is very well chosen, and once again, congratulations to Aspen Institute Romania, because we touch 2 important discussions, innovation and new technologies that have the potential to make our societies resilient, and data. Moreover, on how these are applicable today in a time of crisis. The outbreak of the novel coronavirus has demonstrated us how low resilient are our systems and we as a whole, but has also shown us the great potential that innovation and new technologies could bring in addressing the pandemic. I am the chair of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy into European Parliament, as I was kindly presented. And in my short remarks, I would just like to present the general framework, because I'm sure that the excellent experts that are dealing in depth with the issues will go very much in detail and will present us many interesting aspects. And beside the general framework, I would like also to bring some arguments that data and technological solutions can foster resilience and can help contain the health crisis. Just before the start of the pandemic, at the level of European Union, European Commission came with 3 key communications on artificial intelligence, on digital, and one on management of data. The data strategy and the white paper on artificial intelligence are the first pillars of the new digital strategy of the Commission. And together they are part of a long-term strategy that the Commission is aiming to prepare Europe for the digital evolution, called the Europe Fit for the Digital Age. I can tell you that together with the Green Deal, our digital strategy is one of the very strategic documents and directions on the medium and long term of the development of European Union. And with European data strategy, we'd like to see that EU will become the leader in a data-driven society. This focus on the need to put people first in developing technology, namely they will all be people-centered by design, as well as on the need to defend and promote European values and rights in how they will be designed and produced. Data is at the core of the digital transformation. Data-driven innovation can bring major and concrete benefits to the citizens through, for example, personalized medicine or improved mobility, and to the European economy from enabling better policy making to upgrading public services. As regards to the recommendations at the EU level on how new technology could bring an added value in the containment period, on the 8th of April, the European Commission published a recommendation on a common pan-European approach for COVID-19 mobile applications and the use of anonymized mobility data for contact tracing. In ITRE committee, one of the first discussions that we had with Commissioner Thierry Breton, which is responsible for internal market, but also for industry, and it's very much involved in the digital strategies. And one of his first actions, besides speaking with European companies to produce in Europe covers, masks, and medical equipment, was to discuss with digital companies, with communication companies, in order to discuss together how we could use the technologies available in order to fight with better results and more efficiently against coronavirus. And already everybody mobilized in order to be part of this fight, of course, respecting European laws and all the basic principles that we are all aiming to be respected in this fight. On 16 April, EU member states, supported by the Commission, adopted a new toolbox to use mobile applications for efficient contact tracing and warning in response to the coronavirus pandemic. On the 21st of April, the EDPS adopted guidelines on the use of location data and contact tracing tools in the context of COVID-19 outbreak. Beside the discussion that we had with Commissioner Breton, in ITRE, in a system of video conferences, we had this weeks some discussions over this topic with other representatives from European Commission, from ENISA, the Cybersecurity Agency, with Google and Apple representatives and other representatives, and we are in close contact also with GSA in order to see what are the best tools to use in our fight. The conclusions were that the applications should follow security good practices across the life cycle of software development and follow secure by design principles. And also, we should have in our minds the principles of data minimization and minimum permissions. The conclusions of all meetings were that protecting citizens' privacy is put at the core, and that the protection of data is a fundamental right and will be respected in total. I'm sure that the debate will continue. We debated also in the near past about the need for respecting the privacy, freedoms, and individual rights in the context of anti-terrorism measures, for example, when we first discussed artificial intelligence, and will continue with this very important discussion of the future, and also in the context of debating and voting GDPR rules. But I expect that in the new context of the fight against coronavirus, against the pandemics, now in the future, the debates about freedom and privacy versus efficiency will be even more passionate. I believe that we have to use all the technologies available in order to win the fight against coronavirus now, against future pandemics, and threats, but we have to respect the basic rights and make all our efforts in order to ensure that privacy and freedom will be fully respected. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to stay in contact with you on this issue, and of course any other issues that ITRE committee and European Parliament in general will debate in the near future, and of course take all the good proposals on board in order to improve our work and improve the results. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. You made a few very interesting points: people-centered, human rights protection, but then also you talked about contact tracing and locating data. So I'm sure that the participants, the viewers, the listeners will have a lot of questions about where the line is drawn in times of crisis, as opposed to in times of no crisis. But this will happen, I hope, later in the Q&A session. We did hear from a European institution, from the European Parliament. I do want to move on to the next speaker, who also comes to us from a transatlantic organization this time, so wider in scope than just one country. Dr. Michael Street, who is the head of innovation and data science with the NATO Communication and Information Agency. How does NATO approach the trade-off, the tension between between human rights, privacy, and security and protection?
Many thanks for the invitation and for organising this very timely event on a very important topic. I'll just start with a little introduction of what we do and why we're dealing with data. I'll give an example of something that we've done in response to COVID-19, and then come on to a couple of more general points that fall out of that specific example. I think most of you will know that NATO is a multinational defence alliance, but in that case, we have no option to defer activities or to just pause things until the COVID crisis is past and people are able to return to their office, return to normal. We've had to keep going at a certain level throughout this crisis, throughout this period, and we have. The NATO Communication and Information Agency is a part of NATO. We deliver NATO's IT services, and this is everything from email on the Secretary General's desk to the systems that inform nations in the event of a missile attack. So not just standard IT services, but many of NATO's operational functions and political functions rely on the services that our agency provides. At the start of the COVID crisis, a couple of questions came to our mind, which was, how would it impact our services? Would any of the services that we provide to NATO, that NATO relies on, be impacted by potentially not having staff being taken ill, staff not being able to come to work? And also, what can we do to protect our staff in this situation? And as an example, one of the things that we did was to pull together a couple of data sources, so data that we already had access to. We knew what staff had tested positive, what staff were self-isolating. We knew the status of our own staff. We knew where they worked and we knew what they worked on. So pulling together a couple of those different data sets into one, we were able to see, of all of the services that we provide to the rest of NATO, where are the key dependencies on small groups of staff? And are there any issues that might affect them? Particularly, as many of you know, the susceptibility of serious risk or death from COVID is very age dependent. We have a staff that cover a broad range of ages. So how can we target our structure and our organisation where, if we do have to bring people in, we bring in the ones who are less likely to be affected if they were to contract COVID. So from this, we're able to give our management and our leadership a very clear picture of how COVID is affecting our staff, how COVID affects the systems and the services that we provide and that NATO relies on, and to make sure that we have a very early warning of where there might be some impact if particular groups of specialists are affected or need to self-isolate, if staff that are deployed in particular locations are affected. It's maybe no surprise to find that we didn't have any dramatic issues, but by pulling together a number of bits of data that we already have inside the organization, we at least had some data-driven results. We were able to prove, and our management had confidence that there were no serious issues, that anything that was starting to appear, they had very early warning of and were able to take steps to address it through reassigning staff or moving the location of some services. A couple of things that came out of this is that we were able to take data we have and work out how we can best protect the services that we provide, which is something that NATO, and by extension 1 billion civilians in the North Atlantic area rely on for their security. We were also able to take it and apply it at a much more local level to protect the staff who work for us, so that we're able to take an informed assessment of any risk or impact that might happen to them on an individual level. So it's clear to us from this that being able to exploit data that's available to us can help us with guiding some of our fundamental responses. Using the data that's within an organization can help a lot. Clearly, in many of the areas that we work, we're also taking a lot of information and data that comes from outside our organization. Data which is available from national governments, from media sources, and a whole host of others. Pooling all of that data together can give our leadership a much broader picture, a much richer picture of what's going on. It's based on, in many cases, you can base it on reality of real numbers in terms of admissions to hospital, or amount of economic aspects or transport aspects. Also gives some indication of perception. Some of the media reports maybe don't deal with quantitative aspects, but they deal with qualitative aspects, but sometimes equally as important, or in occasions more so. Being able to pull all of this data together, to merge it, to use it to cross-reference, to cross-check, allows us to give our leadership a better situational awareness of what's happening. It allows them to be able to take better decisions, having better information, take better decisions and make them faster. One of the aspects that we often notice in our data-centric operations are that you never have the information that you really want. It's never available when you want it. It's never of the right quality, even in some of the specific things that we're working on where we're generating the data ourselves. It's not as good as we think it should be. And also, there are always questions about the trade-off between security and privacy and the end goal of, the end purpose of what you're using the data for. That's our current situation. There are many things that we can do to rectify some of those, to work in advance, to be able to make sure that we have in the future crises, future pandemics, that we have access to the data that we really need, that we've taken steps to ensure that we have a better quality of data, particularly important in our environment where we're not just relying on data which is accidentally inaccurate, but that there are cases where the data could be manipulated or data could be poisoned in order to give people a different perspective, so they make different decisions that are not in our organization's interests, but are in the interests of maybe a potential adversary. But there are a number of steps that we can do in advance to work on common frameworks across multiple nations, to work on mechanisms so that we can improve the availability of data, we can improve the quality of data, and fundamentally that we can put in place some guidance, some frameworks on how that data can be used, where we do get an appropriate trade-off between the privacy and security of individuals and organizations that generate that data, and how that data is used at a macro level in order to support the peace and security in the North Atlantic region.
Michael, if I can stop you here, unless you've already finished, because you raised one very important issue, which wasn't mentioned in the previous two presentations, but I hope it will be addressed in the third, which is the issue of coordination, because you did ask, how do we get all of these huge amounts of data that you need from different agencies, different organizations, different nations, different groups, to put it this way. So you did, in a way, raise the issue of coordination, which brings me to the next speaker, also coming from European institution, from the European Commission this time, Mr. Jakub Boratyński, who is the acting director for Digital Society, Trust and Cybersecurity with DG Connect. Maybe in your presentation, Jakub, you could also address the issue of coordination. How do all these European transatlantic institutions then not only coordinate in order to gather data and to verify the quality of data? And I know that you also have a PowerPoint presentation, so you can start. Jakub?
Okay, good afternoon. Perhaps I just start camera for a moment so that you see me. No, we have a presentation. Great. I will use it later. So my great thanks for the invitation, for being able to discuss these issues in this distinguished company. Mr. Bushoy, who actually opened our panel, has given actually an impressive panorama of actually the policy developments in the European Union, which are very relevant to what is happening now. That was the package from mid-February, setting out digital strategy of the Union for the next 5 years, with specific policy announcements on artificial intelligence and data. I would say very timely. It was the early days of the crisis, so we clearly at that time did not realize the magnitude. But this pandemic indeed provides us with a very powerful case of what data can do to help us, what technology can do to help us, but also of the inherent risks that are related to use of data, use of technology. And those risks are actually not just at the level of, let's say, values, but they have a very practical impact on the effectiveness of the measures. So let me go maybe now to the next slide. Yeah, I'm trying to operate. I'm sorry, but I will try. Okay, great. So my idea for this introduction was actually to perhaps dive with you a little bit in one specific, let's say, application or the initiative to which Mr. Bushoy has referred to, that is around contact tracing apps, which, as you have heard, this idea has been announced in the Commission recommendation from beginning of April, but of course we have been very much inspired by developments in East Asia. If you look at this issue from an epidemiological point of view, this idea of contact tracing, it has been always part of how humanity tried to deal with highly infectious diseases. However, the traditional ways of basically tracing people who have been in contact with infected persons basically cannot deliver the results given the volume of contacts we have in mind, and given the need to rapidly scale up the efforts. Doing it manually wouldn't work. So we see this basically a technological tool that can actually be an important element of the public health response to the crisis. But looking forward, it is, and this is the reason why it has been referred to in another very important document from the European Union, that was the roadmap, let's say the idea of an exit strategy for the Union, jointly adopted by the Commission and European Council, pointing out to the fact that this specific tool can help us basically with the confinement measures. Now I will try to move to the next slide. Yeah, that is the reference to the tool, to the Commission recommendation on the toolbox. that was already made by Mr. Bushok. And I would like to move to the next slide, but my iPad, I'm afraid, is a bit yeah, I'm do it. Yes, sorry. Well, so here we try basically in a very schematic way to explain what this tool is about. Yeah, the tool is about that people would have the application installed on their phone, that this application would detect people who have been in relevant proximity with the other users of the applications, and this all becomes valid at the moment when a particular user tests positive and receive a confirmation code from health authorities, which can be then inserted into an app. Those users who have been in touch with that infected person will receive an alert. And again, this has a very practical purpose. They can seek advice. They can actually receive testing and, if necessary, self-isolate. So if you think about the societal challenge that we have, this actually is a measure that can actually make sure that this vital information is reaching people in a very fast way. Right. So here I think we come to the essence of the challenges that we are facing. So for this technology to be useful, we need to fulfill a number of requirements. I mean, all of those requirements will translate into what is absolutely necessary also in the democratic society is the trust of citizens in basically in this type of measure, which potentially can be intrusive, which can basically create all sorts of anxieties and fears about breaches of privacy, about being stigmatized as a person who is sick and could be a threat to the others. So that's why it was so important that in a joint fashion, we could have actually at the European level come to the conclusion what are these basic requirements. So it is very important that there is a certain authority behind them, that public health authorities are seen as those who basically authorize their use, that users actually are not forced to upload these applications. It's clearly voluntary, that those apps are privacy preserving, which means a number of things, which means that they are fully compliant with data protection rules, that they have also latest privacy solutions using, that there is no tracking of location of users, which is a very highly sensitive data, because at the end, it doesn't matter where the contact took place. What we are actually looking for is the proximity, the fact that there was a contact between an infected person and other people. Where it took place, it is not important. And finally, that those apps are interoperable. That you have now, we are now in the process of these apps being developed in member states, and at the end of the day, it is essential that someone who has this app traveling from country A and country B would still be able to benefit from the same functionalities, meaning he or she can still use the same app, can receive messages in the language that person understands, etc. This is, by the way, now a major effort that is happening at the European level. I would say this is a bit of more explanation on interoperability, which, as I said, is at the center of our efforts. And again, in the answer to question sessions, I would be happy to go further. And I think there is just one last slide left, which basically refers to where we are in this process, and it also, I think, refers a bit to the question about coordination. As you know very well, I mean, we do not have a let's say, a uniform approach to health in the European Union. We have a degree of coordination, but this is an area where the competence remains with member states. Nevertheless, in this special time, there was a clear recognition of the need to act together. That's why, for example, in terms of epidemiological advice, we rely on the European agency, ECDC, European Center for Disease Control, based in Stockholm. And of course, all those decisions and this development of the toolbox was not something which was kind of conceptualized in Brussels and imposed, but it was basically a very hard work, literally every day, virtual meetings with member states experts, which resulted in this common approach. So
Jakub, can I
stop
just...
here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it is. So my idea was really to, like, with you, kind of have a bit dive in that specific use case, because I think this is, in a sense, a very powerful practical example of how we are basically, on the one hand, trying to respond to the major imperative to basically protect human life, and at the same time use potentially intrusive technology and collection of data. But again, I'm saying potentially because indeed there is a huge effort on making sure that we take all precautions, which eventually translate both in protection of fundamental rights, but eventually give a chance for this whole operation to be successful, as ultimately trust is essential.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy that you did bring up even twice the issue of trust, because this is something that I'm pretty sure will be reflected into the Q&A session. Before we go to the fourth speaker, let me just remind you, if you do want to ask questions to the speakers, either to a specific speaker or to all of them, do use the Q&A button. A speaker who comes to this debate from business, who comes to this debate with a perspective from business. Mr. Joachim Reiter, who is Group External Affairs Director at Vodafone, I would be very interested when you do your presentation, and also please keep the 10-minute rule in mind. You are the organization, you are the business that the governments will be asking to provide data. What do you do when this happens? Where do you draw the line?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'll be able to answer that question because that's the question that we've been dealing with for the last, more than 8 weeks in the lockdown that we've been in. But maybe to create a little bit of context, because of course, what we contribute to data comes as one leg of a multi-legged effort. And if I start with, we went into the first wave of crisis management on the 31st of January. So we've been in this for quite some time, Frank. And obviously, the first thing you do, much like our colleague, is that you care for your staff and the health and safety of your staff. But I think in that context, we found extraordinarily that things that we didn't think was possible, despite being a tech company, is actually possible. I'll give you a concrete example. More than 90% of our staff works from home. We, of course, have field agents that go out on the field and build base stations still. But things like network operations, something that you would never imagine could be done by people's living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, is now being executed like that. So concretely, 1/5 of the world's internet travels through Vodafone networks. And that's now being run from a few thousand households. So it is a very significant change in our understanding of what is possible. And that leads to some conclusions as we go forward. But it also led us to realize that we could do way more to governments and to help society than perhaps that first meet the eyes. And to put this in context, we basically formulated in the beginning of March, as we had learned from Singapore, Hong Kong, then saw the first wave in Italy. In the beginning of March, we formulated a global 5-point action plan. Number one was, of course, the maintaining the connectivity, which was and continues to be the lifeline of pretty much every citizen and every business. And just to be very clear, that's not just to keep it going. It's you have to deploy massive amount of new investments into capacity, because basically consumption on the data on the network has shot through the roof. The second thing is that we hospitals and health staff surprisingly struggle still with both connectivity and digital applications. So the vast rollout of services for them was being done, including in countries like Romania. Third was the zero rating of health sites and education sites, so that everyone could have access to e-learning platforms or reach their local health provider, including for non-COVID related diseases, which of course we now face a societal backlog in the treatment of those. Fourth was that we rolled out massive remote working solutions, also based on our own experience, particularly for SMEs. In the first couple of weeks of the lockdowns in Europe, we brought 2.5 million people to a work from home situation, many of which, or most of which, have never worked from home before. And the fifth was then the mobility insights, and that's where really the data comes in. Before I get to the data, the second thing I want to say is that this is a long haul. We're going to learn how to coexist with this virus, which basically means that we're now at the phase of formulating what's the next 5-point plan as we deal with the dramatic socioeconomic consequences while still dealing with the pending health situation. And from our point of view, which was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, the key thing will be to figure out how do you leverage digital solutions to foster different degree of resilience in society at individual level, with particular focus on vulnerable customers, at business level with particular focus on SMEs, and at government level with particular focus on provisioning of critical government services. And that's how we see that we fit in. We provide most of the tools to make that possible, and we have changed ourselves, our own mindset of what is possible. The question is whether society as a whole can be mobilized to deploy that and to accelerate that at the speed that is required. And I think we just need to be far more bold than most of the strategy documents or agenda I've seen coming out of Brussels over the last few years. Now that then leads me to the data. So what we've been doing, and there's a difference here also, to be frank, between what we experience in Africa or India versus what we see in Europe, because of the legal frameworks and the emphasis on fundamental rights. That leads the government to also exercise some level of self-restraint in terms of its requests to private businesses, which is much helped, because of course from a Vodafone point of view, we put the confidentiality of communications and the privacy of our customers first. So it's very difficult when a government imposes a lawful intercept type of a regime, basically mandating us to hand over data that we are not comfortable with handing over. And as a locally licensed operator, that puts us in a very, very difficult situation. Luckily, that's not the situation in Europe in any shape or form, mainly because of the strong emphasis that we have through our treaty and through primary legislation that provides, if you want, a standard and a way of working between business and governments that already protects citizens to a very high degree. Now, we have done one thing in particular with respect to data, which is mobility insights. So last slide of our commission colleague here, he talked about using telco data for anonymized and aggregated insights. So we have done that pretty much from day one. It's been a wonderful potpourri of different initiatives across Europe, which of course Vodafone, with our footprint, has been able to leverage our best practices from different markets, and we build a sort of pan-European solution, which is also available in Romania, if the government so would wish to use it. And the demands from governments have been quite different. Italy was super fast, particularly the regions that were affected, Lombardia. Within days after the epicenter moved there, we were working with the regional bodies on mobility insights. So just to be very clear, we are then aggregating and anonymizing large set of mobility from a large geographical area, so as to be able to help the government to ascertain whether they're actually flattening the curve or not. Because most virus propagation models make this presumption around social distancing, and then you read it out in terms of your health data on whether actually it's like that. What we can do by combining health data that comes from authorities with mobility data that comes from us at an aggregated level, and it doesn't matter who the individual is, it's completely irrelevant. It's all about large set of human beings moving around. Doesn't matter their age, doesn't matter their gender. it just to see how they're traveling, you can then get a more granular vision on whether social distancing is taking place in society. You can also see if you have an epicenter, which is quite regional, whether it's likely to spread to another region, depending on whether people move there or not. So in the case of Lombardia, we could show that the epicenter there ran risk of being spread to Tuscany because there were a significant amount of people moving there. We could also show to the, for example, the Milan mayor that despite the lockdown, normally there would be 1 million people moving in and out of Milan on a daily basis. With the lockdown, it was 360,000 people moving around in Milan. So clearly there was a need for more stringent measures, which then subsequently was put in place. Similarly in Spain, we work with the government. They, in their first lockdown measure, excluded the construction sector, which represents around 10% of total mobility. And we could see and advise them on whether construction should move into the same lockdown measures. And that mobility inside plays a role in the containment phase, but also for the future phase as we learn how to coexist. Because if you have local flare-ups of the virus, you will be able to see the likelihood that it spreads to other areas in your territory, because you know broadly how people move around. Now, to be very clear, we have put a massive amount of restrictions on how we do this. So secure by design, privacy by design. We have not collecting any form of data that is not absolutely necessary for the analysis. Don't count samples of people moving around unless it's more than 50 people. In other words, it's 49 neighborhood, it's counted as 0. So only if you surpass 50 do we start counting. And we have taken all these precautions because in the end, for the interest of privacy and the interest of making sure that we are fully anonymizing and there's no possibility of reverse engineering the data, we absolutely can live with less accurate data. Now, where we have struggled is some of the differences of view in member states' transposition of the e-privacy directive means that the accuracy of the data goes beyond what we think is appropriate. Like, for example, in certain countries, you can use network data. In other countries, you will have to use the call data, which basically means that if you have 50 people walking out on the street, but no one makes a phone call, it's registered as 0. So you can only count if you're calling when you're walking out. And that type of restrictions, we don't really understand why they still exist. And I think there's a learning out of this crisis that if you have the right safeguards, the additional restrictions that actually bring the point where data cannot be used is not very smart, because they don't fulfill a privacy objective. They just fulfill some objective that is not anymore purposeful. Now, there's separate, and it's completely separate line of work on contract tracing, just to say. Companies like us were very keen to make sure that governments did not use localization data or local metadata, as we call it, from networks with respect to contract tracing. Why? Because it's pointless. We are not able to identify, and as the commissioner representative correctly said, it's irrelevant where people were physically when they interacted with someone. But the localization data that we have is around 30 meters inaccuracy, which basically means it makes it very, very difficult to measure whether someone interacted with someone else at 1 meter distance. So what we did on contract tracing when we saw that debate coming is that we formulated a position that we advise governments to take. And that 100% aligns with what we now see that the Commission come out with. Consent-based, interoperable, using Bluetooth technology. So there are a number of areas where we took a proactive stance to try to guide governments away from what is not working towards what is working in a privacy-preserving way. And that's why we also joined what was called the PEP-PT, which is the privacy-preserving initiative around contract tracing.
I do want to stop you here. I do want to stop you here. Thank you. It's been very, very comprehensive with a lot of great information, but I am very happy that you brought 2 issues up. First of all, you mentioned resilience, and I'm sure we are going to come back to this. And second, you also mentioned safeguards, and I'm pretty sure we'll also come back to this. We already have questions coming up and popping up. That's why I want to move on, so we leave time for these questions. The last but not least important speaker is Vivian Schiller, who is executive director of the Aspen Digital with the Aspen Institute in the US, and she is the citizen, the expert in this panel. Doesn't come from government, doesn't come from international organizations, doesn't come from business either. How do you see this trade-off? How do you see the drawing the line from as a citizen and across the ocean as well?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be with this really incredible other prestigious panelists. I think that the best thing that I can talk to you about today is sort of the view in the various factions and the view in the United States, where, of course, it needs to be said, the pandemic continues to rage. But the interesting thing that's happened in the US, and it may be different than what's happening in Europe, is that the pandemic has turned on its head the attitudes towards the big tech companies. A few months ago, it would have been absolutely unthinkable to suggest that citizens voluntarily provide Google, Facebook, and other providers with our most intimate information, our daily movements, our contacts, our temperatures, and other physiological changes. But now that doesn't seem so crazy. Eric Schmidt, who was the former CEO of Google, thinks the coronavirus pandemic should teach Americans to be, quote, a little bit grateful, unquote, for powerful tech companies and angry at their government. Now, that's a little bit hubristic, but he's right in that this global health crisis has shifted priorities as everybody is locked at home. Well, now not so much, but there's been a shift in trust, which seems to be the theme of this session. The big focus right now, of course, in the US on this issue is about contact tracing technologies. And as Jakob pointed out, contact tracing has been with us for a very long time. It predates apps, certainly, or smartphones. And it's long been problematic in terms of privacy. But what we're talking about now is tapping into people's phones and medical records, and by doing so, of course, public health authorities hope to identify and isolate potentially infected patients and halt the pandemic. In that light, for many, privacy seems like a luxury. Although that is not the case for everyone. Some of Democratic legislators, I might add, don't think so. A number of fairly well-known senators wrote a letter to Apple saying, quote, Americans should not have to trade their privacy at the expense of public health needs. How is that resonating with the public? Interestingly, Americans are split. According to Pew, just over half of Americans, 52%, so that's almost exactly half, say it would be at least somewhat acceptable for the government to use people's cell phones to track the location of people who have tested positive for COVID-19 in order to understand how the virus spreads. This survey was taken in April. But that still leaves another half, 48%, almost a half, who find this practice to be at least somewhat unacceptable. Interestingly, in that same survey, a majority, not half, but a majority, over 60% of Americans think that tracking people's locations through their cell phone won't even make a difference in limiting the spread of COVID-19. And it may be that there are rights. There are really two sets of problems with app-based contact tracing, according to experts. And I should say, I am not a public health expert, and I don't pretend to be. I am merely expressing the sort of the overall view of the experts. One set of problems has to do with the actual technology. One is that largely, or at least the proposed Apple Google app, is based on Bluetooth. Bluetooth is ubiquitous, but it's also very imperfect. And also, the World Health Organization has said there's only anecdotal evidence of the efficacy of contact tracing apps, and that they cannot replace manual contact tracing and other traditional public health measures. The other set of issues with contact tracing apps, according to experts, has to do with the nature of the disease and the nature of our response. First of all, unless there is adequate testing, contact tracing apps are going to be ineffective. And at least speaking for on behalf of the United States, our testing is vastly inadequate, and there seems to be no really on the horizon moment where it will be. The second issue having to do with the disease and the efficacy of contact tracing is that so many of people who test positive are asymptomatic. So they may not, if they don't have those tests, and again, there's not enough tests, they may not know to input the data into their phone, which of course renders the contact tracing app ineffective. And then the last issue having to do with the nature of the disease and the inadequacy of contact tracing apps is that the people who are most at risk, which tend to be the elderly, tend to be people in very low income communities who maybe don't have the kind of luxury that we do to all come to you via our very strong broadband connections from our home. They are the least likely to have the smartphones that are needed to test the disease. So there are some issues right there. There's also the issue of many experts or privacy advocates say about the nature of the objectives, the goals of a tech company and the goal of public health. So Harvard's Shoshana Zuboff, who is quite a known author and expert on the issues of privacy, points out that people in the public health sector use the word surveillance in a very different way. It has an entirely different meaning to those outside the public health arena. She says, quote, they have public health, they have no interest other than to serve the public interest. There is no secondary game. There's no large amassing of private data for the purposes of manipulation and control. There's nothing but solving the problem, which is getting the disease contained and getting it eliminated. That's it, unquote. Now, that is not to say that tech companies also do not have the goal of getting the disease contained and getting it eliminated. Of course, that is true. We are all humans. We're all part of our societies. We're all in this together. On the other hand, it cannot be said that there is no secondary game, and it cannot be said, unlike with public health, that that is the sole purpose of their work. So finally, what do privacy advocates say? And a lot of this comports with what we saw on Jakob's slide, so I'll just run through them quickly. They say it is critical that we have a sunset clause. When is the time when this data will no longer be collected and stored, that it must be voluntary, that there must be security built in, that there must be full transparency, that it be built on open source technology, and that there be APIs for the technology in order to provide for third-party scrutiny, that there is a limit to the kind of data that's stored. On the flip side, the must-nots are, under no circumstances can the data be sold. There can be no access and no personally identifiable information collected or stored, and of course, no repurposing. So in the meantime, at least in the United States, there really is no widespread contact tracing app available. I think the earliest projections for the Google Apple app is for June. So it remains to be seen what adoption will be, what problems will emerge out of it. We shall see. In the meantime, as I said, the virus continues to rage in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian, for a very interesting presentation as well. We do have a lot of questions that came up on the screen and also by email. What I'm going to do in order to be more efficient, I will try and group them and then give you the opportunity to answer, and then we'll do as many rounds as we can before the time is up. So the first group of 3 questions go like this. Was GDPR privacy enough to protect people's rights? It's not specified to which speaker it is, but whoever wants to pick it up, it is addressed, but whoever wants to pick it up, you're very welcome. Then we do have a question for Mr. Reiter. How does the telco industry take care of data protection specifically when implementing 5G technology? And then we have another question for Mr. Boratinsky in particular, but of course anyone is welcome to address it as well. Would you say that the COVID-19 case is going to push forward a new philosophical and ethical definition of private and public spheres, and also the data pertaining to the 2 spheres? So 5G, GDPR, and a new philosophy. Should we start with you, Mr. Reiter? And
sure.
Please be brief.
Yeah, I'll cover the 5G, but I also would like to touch on the GDPR and privacy. Are they enough? I think the question is not exactly correct. I think the question is, are they fit for purpose? Our understanding and our experience is that GDPR absolutely is fit for purpose. It provides a very robust framework, and we have not found that it stands in the way of an effective response while retaining people's privacy. What we have found is that while you have a common legal framework, you have 27 interpretations of it. And that is a question around more that when the Commission or the European Data Protection Authority issues guidance on how to interpret it, how do we ensure that that actually applies across the whole of the European Union? Because the European Union, as a data hub or an aspiring user of data, cannot have a situation where you have continuous whack-a-mole in every single country on how to interpret common law. On privacy, e-privacy is a different thing. E-privacy is a special legislation that has a good original intention, which was the confidentiality of communications, but then straddles way beyond that. And if that, because of that, it becomes a specific legislation on telcos that is not applicable to other companies that do the same type of services. And for that reason, at least in Vodafone's point of view, we consider that there are some serious learnings out of the experience of how to deal with COVID, in the manner that the Commission is absolutely right in its demand that there needs to be stop to the fragmentation on e-privacy. We should have the same rules across the EU in the form of the regulation. But where we disagree with its previous proposal, and we hope that we'll learn now from the COVID crisis, is around the importance of aligning with the GDPR. The GDPR does provide the right framework, and there's no need for having specific legislation that necessarily go way beyond that for pseudonymization as part of anonymization and aggregation of data. And I think that for us that's very clear. And just to bring that into context, 2 years ago, we actually provided examples in a meeting with telcos and the European Union on how we deal with malaria and Ebola in Africa. And these examples illustrated the role of metadata processing, anonymized and aggregated, for fighting epidemics. We had no clue, of course, at that time that we would 2 years later be facing a pandemic across Europe. But what we highlighted there already then was there were a number of elements in the then proposal for e-privacy regulation that prevented us from doing what we're doing to help people fight malaria in Africa, for example. Now, the second thing is telco protecting privacy in the 5G technology. Well, I think we're protecting privacy no matter which means of communication, 2G, 3G, 4G, or 5G. The beautiful thing about 5G is not only one of capacity and latency, but also because the standards are gradually improving, there is an inbuilt technological improvements in security and of the equipment per se, and the way that we architecture the network. So there is an improvement in overall the security of the network, including therefore protecting people's information. That being said, the way we architecture the network, rather than whether it's which G it is the main way that we protect people's communications. And reality is that governments are actually, other parts of governments are quite concerned that 5G and the beginning of 6G prevents too much their ability to do lawful intercept. So their concern has been different than, it actually proves the point that there is an enhancement in protection to the point where some law enforcement agencies are getting worried, and we are working on how to ensure that we do not undermine the right of law enforcement. But broadly speaking, when you talk about security of networks and therefore security of data networks, all telcos that are serious apply a multifaceted approach, which is the way you use encryption, the way you split up core versus RAN, the way you build firewalls, the way you protect your core, the way you use your vendors in core. It's a lot of things. And in the case of Vodafone, we have around 700 sitting in our cyber security center. On top of it, deals with 23,000 hack attacks annually. So there's way more than 5G. There's no specific elements of 5G. If you want to narrow it down on 5G, then the reality is that the standard for security is higher for 5G than it is for 4G and 3G, which is relevant because that's needed.
Thank you, Mr. Reiter. Michael or Vivian, would you like to pick up any of the three questions that were addressed? And please be brief so we can take other rounds of questions as well. Do unmute your phones if you want to speak, your microphones.
Sure. It's Kuba. Can I come in?
Yeah, please. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I didn't see
on the question of GDPR, and actually, I think I would partially echo what Joachim was saying. I mean, there is definitely essential to think about those legal instruments also from the point of view of enforcement. And then here actually is the real test. You know, the robustness, the the consistency of national data protection authorities, which ultimately are, let's say, on a daily basis, making sure that things work. But beyond that, I think there is a major dimension of the awareness and knowledge of citizens, of people. I mean, one thing is that, you know, you can say there is a group of people who say, we don't really care what happens with our data. But I think, again, this is not so simple, because there is also a real issue of the fact that a significant part of the population do not really understand what's actually happening with their data and what type of risks that creates for the future, which combined also with the incredible market power of some of the leading players, which is actually not so much the case for telco, but it's more for the platforms. You know, it is a real issue, and this is why it is so, let's say, so important for the mandate of this commission that came last year to actually look at those issues from a sort of more holistic perspective. On e-privacy, again, of course, the view of the commission is that we are talking about particularly sensitive set of data, communications data, which again goes back also to the protection of our letters, which is beyond, let's say, protection of our names. So that is the reason why we have been always of the opinion that it deserves a specific set of rules, and we are looking forward that we will finally have a conclusion of these discussions, and there would be ultimately also a level playing field between different, let's say, both traditional telecom companies and the platforms providing communication services. Maybe just this last point, which is very philosophical, I would say, was that yes, so you can see me for a moment. Yes, you see, I haven't been long to the hairdresser. Is the question that I don't have a really crystal ball. Can we really expect that we will have a sort of a profound change? Perhaps yes. I mean, what we are learning every day, that the values that we attach to different public goods is actually not just public goods, but basic things around us. You know, is changing. You know, certain professions that have not been necessarily so valued. You know, like care workers. You know, they seem, these people are absolutely essential for the society. Now, in terms of the trade-offs between privacy and let's say health, protection of life, in a way, this pandemic is not unique. It's not unique. What we are actually convinced is that, and this is what is fascinating and great about technology, that we can actually manage big pools of data, and at the same time do it in a decent manner. And I think, again, our representative of Vodafone very well explained what the telcos companies are doing, which is, by the way, also in line with our discussions and with the Commission recommendation on the use of aggregated data. So
I will stop you here, Jakub, because I do want to go to the other speakers if they have anything to add or to answer to these questions, and still try to take another round of questions. Vivian, you unmuted your microphone, which makes me believe that you want to say something.
No, I was only going to just jump in. Again, I'm my role here is to speak from the perspective of what's happening in the United States. I certainly don't want to. My co-participants are more expert of what's happening in Europe. In that trust in data is problematic in the United States in ways that maybe supersede that are even on top of the other concerns about data and privacy. And that is, there is an unfortunate trend in the United States, only exacerbated by the COVID-19 epidemic, in terms of lack of trust of evidence-based information. And, you know, this comes in large part, this comes from a lack of agreement at the highest levels of government, say between the president and and Dr. Fauci, who's one of the leading authorities on infectious disease, about what information to trust. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is under political pressure in terms of what kind of data they release. So in that confusion, the unfortunate result of that is just a lack of trust in important data needed to get the epidemic under control in the United States, and it's become unfortunately politicized. So it's just wanted to add that's just an extra layer of complexity that we're facing in the United States on top of the normal worries about privacy and data storage and et cetera.
Michael?
Yeah, just a very quick addition to that. I'm fortunate in many respects that we have a very clear role of what our organisation does. It's about peace and security, and therefore in a lot of the discussions which we internally about how to use data, what are the privacy issues around it, there's a guiding principle of a high-level principle that affects the peace and well-being of hundreds of millions of people, which guides what decisions we should take. Also, we're not a commercial organisation, so some of the issues that do come into other organisations around data has some value. If you collect a lot of data, you can use it to inform decisions. You can governments and others can have far better decision making. But somewhere along the line, if that data is being collected, there will be people who look to use it to monetize it, or to use it to influence populations. We've seen that in a number of cases, and I think that's one of the big issues. Legislation and common frameworks can help with that, but that does seem to be what we see nationally or internationally rather, is that there are some different perspectives, different cultural expectations around the globe on what's acceptable and what isn't, and we see that also not just on a national basis, but also the different perspectives from some parts of the private sector versus the public sector also have a different perspective, and it's not an easy circle to square by any means. Thank you. Thank you.
I do want to ask one last question, which was asked by our viewers and participants, and I do want to ask it to all of the speakers, those whom I can see, those who I cannot see, but I presume are still on the call. What is your most important learning from this crisis? Mr. Bușoi, are you still on? No. Jakob, would you like to take this on?
Yes, I am. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Mr. Bușoi, please go ahead.
I unmuted my microphone. Well,
the most important learning from this crisis. 2 minutes.
That we are not prepared, of course, that we invested not so much in our health system, even that we pretended to do so, that health and investment in health are important. This was not happening, and this was the case not only in Central and East European countries or the countries in the south of Europe, where the economic situation is not the best, but even in the countries with good economic situation and with well-organized health systems, with transparent and good health systems, they were not enough prepared. That's why one of the pillars that yesterday was announced by the President of European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, beside the continuation of our policies, beside Green Deal, beside digitalization, which will be, as I said in my introductory remarks, a very strategic direction, was to create a health program at the level of European Union and invest more in health. And here it will be also a chance for digitalization, for artificial intelligence, for digital solution, mobile solution when we talk about health of the future, and of course the debate on privacy, freedom, security, safety will be also in this regard.
Thank you. Jakob, are you still on?
Yes.
Definitely unmuted. Okay.
Yes, I'm still on. It's actually a very tough question. I mean, I have like two types of responses. I mean, first is that the amazing lessons learned is it shows again, I would say, the resilience of us all, of humans, and our adaptability to the situation. So in that sense, we are seeing like what we have always were expecting that will come come a bit against our will. I mean, the embrace of technology, the fact that the meetings which were seen as more something, which is at the margins, like webinars, etc., that this is becoming, our sort of daily. We are adopting very quickly completely new habits, So this is I would say quite amazing. Now, the main lessons learned, I think, it's probably quite banal. I mean, we are now confronted with a challenge which really has no borders. Even if you think about migration crisis, there have been some, let's say, differences in terms of who is mostly targeted. I mean, this basically crisis, this pandemics, makes us all to reflect about, are we doing enough together? I'm doing enough together at the European level, but obviously at a global level. And I would really very much hope that we indeed draw extremely serious lessons from that, being much more willing and able to work together. It sounds a bit naive, but I think this is what we as policymakers have a real obligation to make sure that we will not forget about these lessons once this is over.
Thank you. Mr. Reiter?
Well, with the focus of this seminar, I think for me, the key learning was that resilience through digitization has changed fundamentally in three ways. First, what is possible? We have pushed the boundaries beyond what we ever imagined, and that will have deep consequences if we learn from it. Secondly, what's the expectation of what is and should be possible has changed, in the sense that people just expect things to work through, for example, being able to access healthcare without being worried about having to go to the physical place that a hospital is if there is a COVID case or if a COVID outbreak going on. And third, while we talk a lot about AI and data, actually for most people, it's the most basic things that needs to work. You can't, and it's not super tech things that makes a child capable of following schools in lockdown situation. It's not high tech that makes sure that someone on the countryside is not disclosed from the possibility of working from home compared to someone who lives in an urban environment just because there's better connectivity. This, I think, while it's very important that we think about the high tech, is the low tech that we have failed many times to satisfy people's need in an adequate way. And that's the one that will drive inclusion and create our societies more fair and inclusive going forward. So if we miss that learning, I would be very worried about the future of Europe.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, just echoing what Joachim and others have said. I think we've been surprised by how resilient and how adaptive we can be. And technology and digitization have played a big part of that. It will drive a lot more work to be prepared for the next crisis. But a phrase that often comes up in defense circles is that you never fight the next war the way you fought the last war. And given the way that many governments and leaders are talking about this as a war against COVID, I think that's we will take a lot of steps. They will prepare us better for the future, but they won't prepare us perfectly. The other perspective I'd say, which I'm sure Joachim will appreciate, also being responsible for the cybersecurity of NATO's networks, as well as the networks themselves, is that every new opportunity and every new technology always creates some vulnerabilities. And if we as we inevitably take a lot more steps in collecting data, in using it, in exploiting it and connecting people, individuals, organizations and nations, we have to be aware of what those vulnerabilities will be and how they might be used either deliberately or accidentally with some negative effects. Thank you.
Thank you. Vivian?
Yeah, two takeaways, one bad, one good. The bad, again, speaking for the entirety of the United States, clearly the pandemic has shown that our social safety net is inadequate. So many people are suffering, both when it comes to healthcare and economic support. The good, again, I echo others about the resiliency and adaptability that has been manifest throughout this pandemic. I will add one more, which is the most hopeful at all, which is the profound generosity and compassion of most people I think has really shined through during this epidemic, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone, especially for this round of questions. A lot of good ideas, a lot of good lessons learned. I do hope that we'll be able to follow them through once this is over, and it won't happen like it happens in every crisis. We know what the lessons are learned, but never are able to apply should a next crisis hit us again. Let's hope we get this through as soon and as smooth as possible. Thank you all for participating. Thank you to our viewers and listeners. I'm sorry we couldn't go through all the questions, but I'm sure that Aspen will be generous enough to organize another round of these seminars. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.